welcome you, Roshi, Joan, Halifax, to our Mcgill community, to Montreal, to Canada, from your home in Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Dr. Gottlieb, I thank you so much for your warm introduction. And as well, I want to thank your team. It is such an honor to share a little bit of, what I've discovered over the past 50 years in relation to how we cultivate resilience and sustain ourselves in the midst of conditions that are very challenging. And also I had the opportunity to look at this extraordinary work that you have done in strengths-based nursing in relation to healthcare. And I see there are many points of convergence between this work and what I've been working on as well, the notion of how important it is that nurses actualize care that is deeply person-centered, and that the process of empowerment and of relationality, processes of empowerment and relationality are emphasized. And also speaking about innate capacities. I think many of us are, we in a certain way don't have a clear picture of our capacity to actually meet the world. And your work gives me, great inspiration about the strength that nurses bring, and how do we actually cultivate a culture that recognizes those strengths and also initializes them. So I want to begin with just a few moments of pause. As you can see, I'm in a log cabin. I'm at an altitude of over 3,000 meters in the mountains of Santa Fe, or northeast of Santa Fe, surrounded in fact by 3 million acres of national forest in extreme isolation due to this pandemic. And technology through a satellite dish outside of a cabin that is off-grid, except for a few solar panels and a satellite dish, makes it possible for me to reach through space and to meet you today. But also I'm aware that you've had your own exciting connection in the past 24 hours with the natural world, so and also with the challenges of the cyber world. So I'm glad we found our way to each other in spite of various challenges, including several days of a very intense snowstorm up here in the mountains where I am. So I'm going to invite us to just take a pause, and on the next inhale that you take, to bring your attention just to the inhale and listen to my words, but release whatever else is happening external to yourself or thoughts that are rising. See if you can come just into the body, into the breath. It is just for a moment of grounding. So on the inhale, being with the in-breath. On the exhale, dropping into the body. That's all. We don't have to go through a whole complicated guided practice or instructions. In a moment, for the kind of work that you're doing, being able to state shift is really important. Being able for just one pulse to actually reallocate your attention into your own direct experience of the body through the medium of the breath, releasing mental concerns for a moment and also releasing, clinging to the external world, just one inhale. And in the one exhale, dropping into the body, relaxing. So I'm going to do that right now. A very simple tool, which actually relates to the parasympathetic system, that the stress that many of us experience in caring for others, of meeting institutional needs, makes it challenging for us to reach across to the patient whom we're endeavoring to serve. So much is calling us. One in-breath. Letting your attention rest completely on that in-breath. And an exhale, just drop the body into the body. Let the shoulders drop. Just take a pulse of relaxation. So thank you for that. It helps me too. It's very cold where I am, and it's probably similarly cold where you are. And just having this moment of pause is very helpful. So I had a student years ago, a very remarkable clinician who was a palliative care doc. And I often share his words because they really were key, if you will, or the key that opened the door to an inquiry into compassion and resilience in healthcare. And partly these words reflect something that is the opposite. That is, why is it that so many people in the healthcare field are burned out, experiencing empathic distress, perhaps in relationships with colleagues that are not characterized by a lot of respect. So Gary really opened this question for me in a beautiful way because he was the opposite of that. And he wrote me late one night an email with these words: I'm up late admitting patients to the inpatient hospice unit. And just when I think I'm too old for these late nights without sleep, a person in all their rawness, vulnerability, and pain lays before me. And as my hands explore the deep wounds in her chest, and my ears open to her words, my heart cracks open once again. And this night, a sweet 36-year-old woman with her wildly catastrophic breast cancer speaks of her acceptance and her hope for her children, and she speaks with such authenticity and authority. And her acceptance comes to me as the deepest humility a person can experience. And then again, once again, I remember why I stay up these late nights and put myself in the company of the dying. I think Gary wrote those words to me maybe 10 years ago. That is one beachhead right there. But I feel that the beachhead that many of you are facing today is even more challenging than what one encounters in a standing hospice. We had no idea that we would find ourselves in a global pandemic. We had no idea that our institutions would be challenged in terms of the allocation of resources. We had no idea that family members would not be able to access dying people. And in my country, we had no idea that people would be stacked up almost like cordwood in the hallways of hospitals, as hospitals did not have the rooms to be able to take care of those suffering from this virus. It's a different situation than I think anyone has ever encountered, perhaps in a war zone. And in a way, this is a war zone. And the effects of the pandemic on people who provide care are effects that are not only short-term, but they're also, I believe, long-term. And this is a discussion that I have had over the past 6 months with my colleague at Johns Hopkins, Dr. Cinder Rushton, about how we actually cultivate moral resilience in conditions where we are experiencing moral conflicts and dilemmas that are undermining our morale, our capacity to deliver the kind of healthcare that Dr. Gottlieb is articulating in the work that she does. I also want to read something from Dr. Bernard Laune, who was a great clinician. He has since passed on. But he wrote an extraordinary book in the mid-90s called The Lost Art of Healing. And it was an appeal to restore the 3,000-year tradition of medicine, which bonded clinician and patient in a very special affinity of trust. And he wrote something like the biomedical sciences had begun to dominate our conception of healthcare. And he warned that healing is replaced with treating, caring is supplanted by managing, and the art of listening is taken over by technological procedures. I think what he wrote in the mid-90s is really prescient in terms of what many healthcare providers or many clinicians are facing today. So one of the things that I have spent a deep time on is looking at what is compassion, because this is one of the central values in nursing. And in this regard, I realize that compassion, which often is resisted, even though it's a central value and principle of nursing, and has in some ways a kind of bad rap as being maybe religious or providing or prioritizing care over justice and so forth, or that, you know, being compassionate, you're in boundary situations that could be violated. I really began to look at compassion as one of the most important experiences that can provide the foundation for our resilience as healthcare providers. And I remember something His Holiness the Dalai Lama said: compassion is not a luxury, it's a necessity in order for the human species to survive. And I think it's a necessity in order for nurses to survive. But you have to ask, what is compassion? And I began to work with neuroscientists and social psychologists and realized that compassion is actually composed of non-compassion elements, including exactly what we did at the beginning of this talk, which is to bring our attention not into the sort of scattered field of attractors, of beeping machines and calls for help and disturbed thoughts, but to allow our attention to really be grounded in our moment-to-moment experience to the best of our ability. And I also realized that compassion was not possible without having pro-social affect, you know, without really caring about people. And I was speaking yesterday evening with an emergency room doctor, and I said, you know, why do people go into medicine? Why do people end up being nurses and doctors? And she said very directly, because we care. We care. And that care is something that is important to sustain and to restore when that sense of caring is lost. So pro-social affect is really important. Also, an ethical intention, and an intention which is basically non-selfish, again, going back to pro-sociality. Now, that is that, we entered into this field. I entered into the end-of-life care field with the deep aspiration to change the culture of medicine around the care of the dying. And this was in 1972, or actually 1970, excuse me. It's a long time ago, 50 years ago. That aspiration, that intention has not changed. And then also insight, our capacity to discern clearly, to see deeply into what is transpiring in any given moment without the interference of internal biases or other expectations. And finally, the will to engage is essential. And what I realized in doing this work of being 50 years in the end-of-life care field, of decades of training clinicians and caregivers, and of being also, eventually I ended up being a Buddhist teacher, as Dr. Gottlieb has said, old abbot of a monastery, but really my work is truly about, the transformation of the culture, not only of medicine, but our world to the extent that is possible. So compassion is engaged. And it's important also, I think, to understand that compassion, the other thing I wanted to say is that each of the capacities about which I spoke briefly are capacities that are trainable. And as such, then we understand, we train in this suite of compassion, and what emerges in this complex dynamical system is compassion, the process of compassion. So just simply, compassion involves the capacity to attend to the experience of others, to feel concern for others, to sense or to see what will serve others, and potentially to be of service. Now, Dr. Gottlieb spoke briefly about this book I've written, Standing at the Edge. And this book articulates 5 what I have called edge states. These are states of virtue or deep capacities that I think are essential in actualizing the path of nursing. However, each of these virtues, these processes, these geographies have a shadow side. And these shadow sides were made visible to me in part through my own experience, because who has ever written a book about what they've not been through themselves? But by the fact that in my encounter with clinicians, with people in human rights organizations, with educators, parents, and many others, I realized that one of the greatest sources of suffering in relation to our experience as those who care are the greatest source is these 5 states that I talk about in my book, Standing at the Edge. And I call them edge states because of they have a valence that is toxic and a valence that is healthy. And I want to just very briefly go over these valences, but I want to kind of give you what can I call this? A morsel to understand that our failure to sustain ourselves, for example, in the geography of altruism, on the high edge of altruism, and when we go over that high edge and in fall over, That experience of losing our grounding can, in the end, be leveraged into strength through the actualization or the application of compassion, and actually enhances our strength in the end once we climb up back to the high edge of any one of these edge states. So I see, I have 4 minutes, so I'm just going to go through them, and we'll take a breath and then answer questions. The first edge state that I write about is pathological altruism. And this altruism, we understand, of course, is essential for our survival. But when altruism becomes toxic, this is when we experience physical, mental, social, economic harm, psychological harm in relation to our own experience, or cause such for those whom we're serving, or cause such for the institution in which we're serving, or in which we're endeavoring to serve. An example is Haiti. The UN, after the earthquake, sent people down and caused quite a bit of difficulty, as many of you know. Empathy, second edge state, important, being in resonance physically, emotionally, and cognitively with the person whom we're serving. But when empathy is not regulated, it can become dysfunctional, and our exposure to the suffering of others can overwhelm us. Moral suffering, and I want to talk about that more in the second session. And this involves experiences of moral distress, moral injury, moral outrage, and moral apathy, all leading to moral disengagement. Disrespect, the fourth edge state. And this is respect is essential in our experiences as a healthcare person, whether nurse or volunteer or chaplain or doctor. But it was really through a nurse that I learned about horizontal hostility, about a toxic expression of respect that had to do with bullying, disparaging, putting down our colleagues. And what Jan Johnner did, she joined our chaplaincy training, and she very interesting wrote an extraordinary thesis actually on horizontal hostility in nursing, indicating that many nurses actually leave the profession of nursing because of disrespectful behavior, bullying behavior from their colleagues. And then vertical violence. And this is when we put down those who are so-called beneath us in rank, or we are put down and so forth, and it can be bottom up as well. I teach in Japan. I teach doctors and nurses in Japan, and have heard too many stories about nurses, most of whom are women in the Japanese context, who are bullied by patients. And of course, we know about this behavior, from your experience, and Dr. Cinda Rushton at Hopkins and many other nurses have shared with me issues related to vertical violence from bottom up, where nurses are treated in ways that are really disrespectful. And then engagement, which is very important, that we are wholehearted in relation to our experience of service. But the shadow side is burnout, where the cumulative work demands, where cumulative stress, where a toxic work atmosphere, where poor agreements with the institutions that we serve, or where we ourselves, our identity is sort of wrapped up in how we work and how much we work. We, in America anyway, south of the border, you say, how are you doing? Well, I'm really busy. And that is a mark of your value. Or that the work that you're doing feels meaningless or even harmful. So this is Christina Maslach's work and Freudenberger's work in burnout, and how we transform the experiences of burnout back into engagement and resilience. So I'm exactly at my time for this first session. And just in conclusion, for those of you who stay, we're going to dive in a bit deeper. But I thank you, and I just invite us to come back briefly to this grounding experience, bringing our attention to the inhale, exhale, relax. And understanding that the parasympathetic system, which is stimulated through our relationship, our positive relationship with our respiratory system, conduces to the experience of connection. So thank you. And I think we're open to questions now for 10 minutes. Hello.
Hello. Hello. Thank you very much, Roshi, Joan, Halifax. Thank you for that. We really appreciate it. My name is Rosetta, and I'm part of the committee. And one of the things that we were wondering is when we talk about compassion fatigue, it's a term that often gets used in healthcare. And perhaps it's not a term that you use. So could you help us understand a little more about compassion fatigue?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that question. Actually, there's a large group of us in the field who would like to liberate that term from the experience of nurses, doctors, and so on. And I want to just cite the research done by Tanya Singer at the Max Planck Laboratory in Leipzig, where she is a neuroscientist who's done a lot of neuromapping of where in the brain, these different experiences or different processes show up. And then there you are. What did she discover? She discovered in working with Mathieu Ricard, the very renowned contemplative, that there's very distinct differences in neural mapping between compassion and empathy. And that what people call a compassion fatigue is not compassion at all. It's actually empathic distress, coming from empathic over-arousal and the poor regulation of the experience of resonance with the presence of suffering. And so I actually would like to see the term compassion fatigue out of our world. What we know from the neuroscience research and from research in social psychology, and this is very important, is that compassion is a win-win situation. It enhances the well-being of the person who's experiencing it. And we have this again on evidence from neuroscience and social psychology, including immune enhancement. It enhances the experience of the individual who is receiving compassion. It enhances also those who perceive compassion, that they feel morally elevated. And when compassion is not exercised, whether it's witnessed or whether we engage in withholding compassion ourselves, there is the experience of moral compromise. So this is a very important question that you've asked. And I suggest that you read the work of Tanya Singer and Mathieu Ricard. I'm sure Thupten Jinpa also has addressed this in one way or another. He lives in Montreal and is very much involved with this kind of content. And it's been, I think, an obstacle, if you will, to the kind of values that are based in inherent affect that we feel is so essential for the well-being of ourselves as human beings and also of those whom we're related to. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful. In the chat, there's a question from Carmen that's asking if we can discuss a little bit more about sex and gender issues in terms of how women can balance natural caring capacity and self-preservation.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that is very important, and this is a really great question, and we only have 10 minutes, so, or 5 more minutes. But there is, again, evidence in neuroscience that women do tend more toward caring behaviors, that there are some, interesting gender distinctions. And by the way, all the exceptions, I think, are important to recognize as well. There are women who are very uncaring, and there are men who are very caring. So I don't like to categorize things in two, men are from Mars, women are from Venus kind of way. But what we see, interestingly enough, is that there are some differences that are not inconsequential. And so one of the things that I think is very important is to have tools that are available that enhance insight so that one can be somatically sensitive. In other words, to be able to read our own somatic experience, to track it, so that when we are upregulated, when we are going over the edge, when we're about to pitch into vicarious suffering, empathic distress, when we're moving into burnout, when we're experiencing moral injury, it shows up somatically. And if we're dissociated from the body, then these kinds of signals that we're getting from the body are not reaching, if you will, our prefrontal cortex. We're not noticing, we're not putting our attention to where it needs to be. And so that if you will, the wake-up call is not being heeded, and we just plow ahead and cause ourselves more and more distress until we're basically incapacitated. And so applying these tools, the very simple one that I just began this talk with, of just bringing your attention to the breath, which brings your attention into the body, of noticing on the exhale, dropping into the body and noticing whatever is alive for you physically in any given moment, and respecting that we have a phrase that we share with caregivers: may I see my own limits with compassion, just as I view the suffering of others. So this is really essential. This reflects a value of not only the respect for our patients and trying to do everything we can to alleviate suffering, but self-respect as well. And too often our value as women is located in us sacrificing ourselves and causing ourselves harm and rendering ourselves useless in the end. So it's a very important question. Self-tracking, self-understanding, insight, and firm commitment to regulate our experience to the extent that we are able, and to have appropriate agreements with the institutions or the teams that we're a part of. I hope that's a little helpful. I'm just noticing the time, so I'm very conscientious about time. I want to just see how you want to work
Thank
this?
you.
Because
Thank you very much. I think we can take one more question.
Okay.
And one of the other questions in the chat is, I think sort of the theme that's coming up is sometimes the nurses are feeling, how can their voices be heard with regards to the need for respect? And sometimes it feels the employer or government that they're a little more concerned with the productivity and the costs versus the value of nursing and the nursing care.
This is a great question. And again, time limits, but I think, excuse me, I think one of the important things is to understand the value of conscientious objection. That is to say, when things are being asked of you that are inappropriate, that cause harm to the patient, cause harm to yourself, where institutions are engaging in what is called structural violence, that is marginalizing, for example, or deprioritizing the well-being of caregivers, including most importantly the nurses. The institution the culture of the institution has to change, and you have to build bridges. You know, talk to the powers that be, so to speak. But also sometimes nurses have just sat down and said, no, this is causing harm to our patients. This is causing harm to our family members. This is causing harm to the institution and to those of us who are serving in this institution. So conscientious objection is one of the many bridges that we can engage in order to transform the toxic aspects of the culture of medicine. It's a tough road, but it's not just, excuse me for using a kind of crude term, just sucking it up. That harms patients, it harms you as a provider, and ultimately it harms the institution in which you're serving. So building bridges of communication, setting up what Dr. Gottlieb has done, groups that bring the values and principles of healthy caregiving forward, and getting buy-in from the institution. And if the institution is just out for money, sometimes one has to actually take further steps, if you will. It's very important at this time that we bring deep moral values when the medical institutions are under such stress, both in terms of resources vis-a-vis patients, but also just sustaining themselves. And these institutions will not last except for you. You are the ones who are making these institutions possible.
Thank you, Roshi, for answering those not easy questions. And we truly appreciate the insight and the expertise, which will bring us all, I think, collectively and individually to reflect on the importance of our role individually, but collectively as a profession. I think we can now start with the second portion of our program. And at the end of that portion, we'll have some time for further questions.
Wonderful. So I'm very conscientious about time. And so this, I'm looking, it's now 10:50. I have 25 minutes, is that right? Okay, great. So all right. So I want to just take a moment as we begin this second session to, again, thank the organizers for this meeting that we're having. I'm really honored. And what I want to address in part is the profound importance of your intention as individuals, but also as teams to serve those who are suffering. And also your intention to work in healthy systems so that your capacity is enhanced in being able to deliver health care. I'm going to ask us for just one moment to just take a pause right now. Again, using the breath on the inhale, really letting your attention rest just on the physical sensation of the in-breath. And on the exhale, relax. And for a moment, I'm going to ask you to reflect on what brought you, what inspired you, what called you into the path of nursing. And notice if you don't want to do that. Not judging, but just for a moment, what brought you? What brought you to this path of nursing? And notice what your physical experience is as you remember what we could call your calling. And notice what feelings are present for you. And what thoughts emerge. And on your in-breath, again, without judging, sometimes, over Zoom or something, it's, people don't really want to do these little exercises. That's fine, but it's helpful, potentially. Again, why did you enter nursing? What has brought meaning to you in this service to others? In the midst of this pandemic, how do you keep meaning present for you? Or is it vividly present? And returning to nursing as a calling. Just allow yourself to feel into that sense of connection, of inspiration. You put so much life, energy, resources into becoming a nurse. To address directly the pain and suffering of others. Okay. Now, coming out of the inquiry state for a moment, understand that this is a resource for you. You didn't enter into this work to make money, to be powerful, for ego needs. For most of you, if not all of you, it's a calling. It has to do with your moral character. And sometimes you lose the thread as individuals and also as a team of what brought you to this path. And one of the most important things, I believe, that what we can do who serve those who are catastrophically ill, of working with families in terrible stress, of working with clinicians as they face unanticipated challenges, including the challenges that none of us dreamed of we would be facing today, is to remember why. It is a resource for you, a resource that I encourage you to return to. Do not lose this thread, because this is the thread of integrity. This is the thread that holds your practice together as an individual, as a team, and also as a social unit. Does this make sense to you? I hope it does. You know, I'm not a moral philosopher, but as an anthropologist, a recovering anthropologist, it's been very clear to me that there are many different moral platforms from culture to culture and even from person to person. But most importantly, because I saw these differences in cultures, the various cultures in which I worked as a young anthropologist, and also in working with many dying people over the past 50 years. What is, you know, in the view of others, what is right and wrong, what will serve and what won't serve. But my own practice of Buddhism gave me a different way of looking at integrity, and that is one that looks through the lens of suffering. And that when we cause suffering to ourselves or to others, our integrity is violated. So it comes back to the earlier question that someone asked in relation to how do we set good boundaries? How do we enhance resilience when so much is being asked of us? When we cause suffering to others or ourselves, our integrity is violated. And when we alleviate the suffering of others, or we do not violate our own personal self-integrity, our own well-being, then our integrity is affirmed. So in this way, we come to understand how important integrity is in the role of nursing, of how we take care of our patients and not separate from ourselves. And also, it does not serve the institutions that we work in when we violate our self-integrity or the integrity of others. And this has to do with our values, which we reaffirm, as I said at the beginning of this session, understanding that what brought us to nursing, which is this deep aspiration to serve others, This affirms our character, if you will. And yet, I'm sure all of us are deeply aware that our integrity also can be fragile, can be vulnerable. And we get pushed over the edge. And so part of the work that we are doing as individuals, as we become more awake to the conditions that we're facing now, has to do with maintaining the strength of our convictions, of what's really important to us, and taking actions that are consistent with our ethics. So I wanted to talk about 4 different geographies related to moral suffering. And I think that this is particularly relevant today. Again, going back to this foundation of how we not lose the sense of our deep commitment to the values associated with civility, human decency, care, concern, and care. So moral suffering is a kind of umbrella term that I use to cover various valences related to the violation of our values, of our principles. And this can relate at the individual level, at the team level, or the institutional level. And moral suffering is the harm that we experience in relation to actions that actually transgress our tenets of what we mean by basic human goodness. And the first geography that I speak about is moral distress. And that is the pain or anguish that we can experience in the body, in our emotional continuum, psychological continuum, in our mind, how our thinking processes become bitter, for example, or in our relationships. When we become aware that there is a moral problem and that we as an individual or as a team or as an institution that we have the responsibility to address that issue. Just as this, an earlier question, what happens in an institution when, how do we sustain ourselves that's asking too much of us? We say there's a problem here and we have a responsibility to address it. And we might even have determined a remedy. But moral distress arises when we are unable to actually act on that remedy because of internal or external constraints. And we find ourselves, our team, our institution, involved in something that is experienced as moral wrongdoing. I think this is not uncommon in medicine today. Whether it's the allocation of PPE or of blood products or of respiratory product, it's just what happens when we feel like our commitment, our dedication to ending suffering, we see the violation of our capacity to actually meet that suffering because of internal or external constraints. You know, I was thinking about a group of nurses that Dr. Rushton and I worked with at Johns Hopkins who worked on in the CICU. And I wrote about this in the book about a man who received a heart transplant. Might have disguised it and turned it into a woman in the book. I don't remember, but in any case, it's a kind of heroic surgeon, you know, with a big commitment to save a life. And this is very rare situation, not the heroic surgeon so much, but this patient was in the CICU at Hopkins for 9 months, going through a cascade of medical catastrophes, eventually died. And when Cinda and I began to work with this team, they were in paralysis. They experienced actually all of these valences that I'm going to briefly address, including profound moral distress. There's so much moral distress that, you know, sometimes the nurses did not want to walk into the room of the patient because the patient was suffering so much, or the smell coming from the ulcers on the patient's body were so, the smell was so horrific that, you know, there was this experience of avoidance. And that led some of these nurses to experience this second geography I'm going to talk briefly about, which is moral injury. And this is a psychological wound that results from witnessing or participating in a morally transgressive act. Now, this is primarily associated, or has been primarily associated with the military, but we see it all over medicine. And moral injury has tragic outcomes from addiction to suicide, depression, self-hatred. It's a toxic, festering mix of dread, of guilt, and of shame. And related to moral injury is, but it's an outward expression, is moral outrage. And this is an externalized expression of indignation toward others who have violated social norms. And it's a very complicated mixture of anger and disgust. So the final one is moral apathy. And this is when we simply don't care or don't care to know, or when we're in denial, or when we're using, if you will, everything from lifestyle to substances, obsessive behavior, and so on, numbing us so that we are dissociated from suffering, moral apathy. And in our work with people who are profoundly ill, and with families, you know, who can't accept the truth of a family member's suffering or imminent death, you know, there can be a residue, and there can be this sense, what's called moral residue, of unmet obligations and commitments that occur when we have to make hard choices, and we have to prioritize one value over another. And we have to make decisions over, you know, between competing obligations or commitments. So we can look at moral residue as the accumulation of unprocessed moral suffering and the leftover consequences of being in the grip of a moral conflict. So now how do we, and this is a very complex geography, and how do we enhance our capacity to be resilient and to work progressively, if you will, healthily with these situations? And I just want to mention a few things. There's a lot to be said here. But, the first is to realize how important it is to be aware of our subjective response to what's happening in our encounter with our colleagues and our patients, and to notice upregulation and to notice signs of stress, and to actually call yourself back into getting grounded. Again, this in-breath, or allocating your attention. For example, in Nepal, I have organized for the past 40 years clinics at high altitude in the Himalayas for people who have no access to medical care. And in one of these early clinics, a child who was burned horribly was brought into the clinic and had to be debrided without anesthesia, and it was a nightmare. And I almost passed out, actually, as I was standing in the room where this procedure was going on. But I allocated my attention to the sensation of my feet on the floor to get grounded. And this began to regulate my cardiovascular system and my nervous system. It was very important. It was the sort of first time that I had used an actual tool, taking my attention and reallocating it for just a moment to regulate my somatic response to something that was external to myself. So that's one way. Another is how we began this session. It's remember why you're here. To recall your dedication to your service to others, and to understand that this is a profound resource for you. Another approach is to not spend your energy railing against reality. These are tough times that we're in, and anyone working in medicine today is facing it squared. And yet the kind of exercise of complaint, of rage, of helplessness, lack of agency, actually takes agency away from us. And in part, it has to do with letting go of our expectations. And again, going back to my earlier talk, is the value of having a very clear discernment of what is transpiring in reality. And looking clearly, with a sort of grandmother's eye at, because grandmother has been through the waves of birth and death, and looking squarely in the face of reality and knowing, things could change at any moment. This is very difficult. It's important to stay grounded and to remember why I'm here. But one of the most powerful ways that I have found for people to do this work is the tool that I developed called Grace. And I've given you the first two parts of that tool. Grace takes this content, this heuristic map of compassion that I developed years ago, that I described a little bit earlier in general terms, and puts it into a tool for clinicians. And it's a mnemonic that's very simple. It's just, you pull it out of your back pocket, so to speak. The G of Grace is gathering your attention, just as we did. The R of Grace is recalling your intention. This is a resource. The A of Grace is attuning first to your own subjective experience, somatically, affectively, cognitively, before expanding your subjectivity, if you will, to include the experience of another, so that you can be first grounded, so that you can become aware of your biases. So you can stimulate the parasympathetic system and so forth. And then expanding your subjectivity is what we call, in this case, empathy. To be in resonance with the physical emotional and cognitive experience of the other. Attuning, the A of grace. And the C of grace is to consider what will serve based on being grounded, being resourced by your intention, and by being aware of your own experience and in resonance with the experience of the other. The C of grace, consider what will serve, looking deeply. And based on that, the E of grace, engage. What action arises? What is appropriate? And this can happen in an instant. Of course, how we train it, it takes more time. We go through Dr. Tony Back and Cinda Rushton and I who do this training. We parse it down into, small pieces so that people learn how to do this, each of these steps well, and then it comes together, these suite of features. Engage is the E of grace, based on attentional stability, based on intention, based on self and other attunement, based on discernment, considering what will serve. Then the E of grace, engage. And then importantly, end. What is it to end these interactions, to complete, to acknowledge internally or interpersonally? Perhaps forgiveness needs to be asked of oneself or other. Appreciation, gratitude, completion, ending is essential. Grace. So thank you. I am 2 minutes over. I apologize, but I'm very happy to answer any questions over the remaining 10 minutes that we have. And I appreciate you listening.
Thank you so much for all of those inspiring, I would say beyond words, a lot to reflect on and to embody and think about. We have had a few questions in the chat, and I will do my best to be able to collect some of the main themes. There was a question that was interesting in terms of, and I will read it textually, in regard to integrity. How does one maintain integrity with respect to ourselves as nurses without the feeling of guilt?
Mm. Oh, that's such a powerful question. And at the end of this piece I did on integrity, I talked about moral residue. And the work that I think is really important is to have a very self-honest relationship with our challenges, our weak spots, our failures, and so on, and to understand this is what it is to be human. It doesn't always turn out perfectly. And to create a toxic narrative of guilt and shame, moral injury, because we haven't been able to meet the needs, and the needs of our patients or our institution or our expectations of ourselves is adding fuel to a fire. And much of the work that we have to do as those who are offering healthcare has to do with strengthening our capacity to live in our imperfect world and to appreciate that the gift that arises out of this, we could call humility. I mean, the worst thing is, it's like the cardiac surgeon who's has this kind of omnipotent, relationship with the work and causes, as the case that I spoke about, almost irreparable suffering to the patient who died. So that was irreparable, but also to the nurses who were serving that patient. But I'll tell you what those nurses did. They were so messed up. I really have to tell you, they suffered from moral distress, moral injury, moral outrage, and moral apathy. Some were just numb. And what those nurses did over a 2-year period, and Cinda who's at Hopkins. I was just in the first meetings with the nurses working with them. They pushed through policies in Johns Hopkins, which is a big, powerful, resistant institution that had to do with protecting the integrity of patients and providing the means for nurses who are on the front lines of healthcare delivery, daily seeing these patients, the means to report what they felt were ethical violations in terms of the care of this person, causing undue and unwarranted suffering. So and that happened, took 2 years. That team is still together. And that team almost broke up. It takes hard work, but it's work that enhances moral resilience and the morale of the team, and also the value of that team within the institution.
Thank you. I think it goes back to what you say of connecting back of why we chose this path individually as a team, and bringing it back to the patient, where the care and what the job of nursing is not separate from ourselves.
Right.
And I think that that's powerful. And as educators and as what we have in our healthcare system, where we have students, but we have new staff coming into the profession. So the people who train, the mentors, the preceptors, I wonder if you would offer some wisdom in terms of how do we impart that in those who are joining the rank, so that they will stay connected to their path and why they chose the profession.
Well, I think nursing is the kind of perfect platform for bringing these values into high relief. It's in the very vows that you take as a nurse. It's the basic principles of nursing. The work that Dr. Gottlieb has done in her method or her grid, I think is incredibly important. And it has got to start the first day a young person moves into the education stream of nursing. In other words, I in 19, I remember it so long ago, 70, I joined the University of Miami School of Medicine as a medical anthropologist. And there was a new dean there, Emmanuel Papper, who was an anesthesiologist. And he set it up so the first day that a medical student's educational experience, they went with an interprofessional team over to the Veterans Administration Hospital and sat with patients directly. It wasn't going just into science in the classroom. It was about relationality. It was about respect between team members, and it was about connection and care. The very first day in medical school. So often it's STEM, you're into the science only, but this is about human relationship. And so it has to do with the transformation. Again, but Dr. Gottlieb's work is so important in this regard, not only in the values, but also the actual behaviors, how we educate nurses today. And I don't know how it happens in Canada, but that's my humble opinion.
Thank you. That's very insightful and very useful, because we have a true responsibility for those of us who are already in the profession.